In the beginning, our God created the world, a beautiful world, a world of excess and tranquility. And when our God grew lonely, he populated his world with creatures, all of which he made in his own image, similar so none would feel disadvantaged in this world of endless grassy plains, timid rivers, and countless fruit-bearing trees. All creatures lived in relative peace and harmony, for you see, while only we, the annalists, were blessed with the gift of sentience, all others were at least given a basic understanding of how a living creature should act and behave while under the watchful, caring gaze of a generous and kind God. There was no need for strife or fear, for no one lacked anything. Even if one could not find the strength of will to get up and pluck some fruit, one could just wait, sleep, and expect themselves to wake up healthy and refreshed. Our God, in his infinite wisdom and thoughtfulness, had seen fit to imbue the air we breathe with plenty of nutrients and designed our primary star in such a way that no matter what, life would always be sustained. Of course, as you know, over time we grew bored. We began to thinker and ponder. We looked at the heavens and wondered what else was out there. We invented the wheel, scripture, computers, and so much more, until eventually we found ourselves floating above our own meager beginnings, our cradle world. After millions of years of technological advancement, we'd finally done it. We'd left our God's embrace, that beautiful green and blue ball he'd made for us. We had grown up as a species, ready to venture out and look for others who wished to ponder and explore the cosmos with us. We set out to discover faraway systems. We landed on strange yet similar worlds, no doubt made by gods who were just as amicable as our own. And just when we were starting to think we were all alone, we found them. Aliens, creatures who were so similar and yet at the same time so very different. Over time, wherever we looked, we'd find more and more, all born on paradise worlds, specifically tailored to their inhabitants' needs, undoubtedly made by responsible gods just like our own. As our gods had intended for us, we began to cooperate. We constructed ginormous structures, explored and learned together, and continued to grow as if we were all one big family. The Great Galactic Alliance, we called ourselves. And for a time, all went well. It seemed that beyond the odd black hole or ugly gas giant reality in and of itself was generally a warm and kind place where all sentient creatures could come together as one and enjoy life. That is, of course, until we found it. Ever since ancient times, our most esteemed philosophers, scientists, and clergymen theorized about there being a world opposite to all others. One where creatures lived who'd indulge in every possible taboo, where life cannibalized itself and would do anything to ensure its own continued existence. A world of chaos, filled with the coldest colds and the hottest hots. A world of unstable climates, shifting topologies, and horrific disasters, where one's entire way life could change at the drop of a hat, where nothing was guaranteed and that which wished to survive had to continuously adapt and overcome. A world where only the strong survived and are forced to transform in accordance to the laws of this infernal place. I wouldn't even dare imagine what sorts of horrifying monsters would call such a place home. They'd undoubtedly be warped and twisted beyond mortal comprehension. Their very existence would breed terror and madness in the minds of the particularly innocent and weak-willed. Most of us assumed, or perhaps hoped, that such a world could not possibly exist, that it was just a scary yet interesting what-if scenario. We thought there couldn't possibly be a divine creature that harbored such malice, apathy, and warped sadism. We thought wrong. When the GA Gracefulness arrived at what we now call the Hela system, they imagined that they'd probably find a couple gas giants in a habitable world made by a good-aligned but otherwise lazy god. Unfortunately for them, nothing could have been further from the truth. We're not entirely sure what they witnessed, but not even 12 hours after arriving, they'd already activated every single emergency system several times and sped out of there as quickly as their hyperdrive would allow. Upon being rescued, the crew was given a full medical checkup and psychological evaluation. Most of them were panicked at best and near catatonic at worst. Whatever was out there, it had fractured their minds and would undoubtedly pose a threat to the entire galactic community if not taken care of quickly. And thus, without further ado, an exploration fleet was tasked with investigating, said strange cosmic anomaly. I think we all deep down knew what was about to be revealed to the wider galaxy. We all just sort of prayed we were wrong. About 8 months later, the exploration fleet returned, and our worst fears were confirmed. There it was, floating on the screen, a blue ball of death and chaos. GA-14, a world of death, inhabited by horrifying monster and twisted abominations. It looked like a malicious tumor on the canvas that is the universe. If the Alliance's bravest and brightest were to be believed, then this planet was apparently infested with every possible nightmare ever conjured up by sentient minds, anything from gigantic flesh-eating lizards to tiny microscopic viruses. Even this world's flora had a penchant for death and destruction. There was no denying it. We'd finally found it. The world created by the goddess of the never-ending struggle and eternal misery. While all other divine beings aligned themselves with good, and the light she cast of these weaknesses, she saw them and created a world of strife and destruction. Unfortunately, as we'd suspected, we couldn't keep things under wraps for long. When the news finally made its way to the public, most sane people were of course mortified and shocked, but as is often the case, the youths, found themselves taking a less conventional stand. Many claimed to be bored with the current state of things and intrigued by this strange world of horrors and the creatures who live upon it, a sentiment proven and reinforced by the copious amounts of fringe literature and homemade movies said heathenish curiosity spawned. For a time, we tried to pretend it didn't exist in the hopes that it would just disappear from the public conscious. But alas, the longer we kept ignoring it, the longer its very existence kept gnawing at us. It's as if it was mocking us, taunting us into destroying it, and so eventually, we obliged. At first, we tried to simply freeze the hell world by blotting out the sun. We assumed that a prolonged ice age combined with lowering sea levels would wipe out most, if not all, creatures. But somehow life persisted. Hell, in the time it took us to return for our second attempt, this world had already been completely repopulated, with fresh new horrors which looked even more awful and terror-inducing than the first. So seeing as freezing didn't work, we tried the opposite approach. We amplified the sun's rays and began to scorch GA-14's surface. We dried out large bodies of water and prematurely activated every volcano we could find. At first we thought we'd succeeded, that the universe was safe at last, but upon taking a closer look, it seemed that a couple tenacious little buggers survived. No, not just survived, they thrived. It was only during our third attempt that we figured out we were making a huge mistake. You see, at this point, we had enough. We could practically hear this disgusting world and its wicked goddess taunting us. It was as if we were being toyed with. And so with very few options left, we decided to make use of certain forbidden sciences we'd once sworn to never unleash upon the universe. I won't bore you with the finer details, but in short, we used technologies that should never have been wielded by mere mortals. We tampered with their atmosphere, quite literally took the breath from their lungs, poisoned every body of water we could find, and for good measure used kinetic gravity-based nukes to try and destabilize their world's core and its tectonics plates, or at least more so than was already the case. We tirelessly observed while methodically tearing this planet apart, one atom at a time, and just like before, everything quickly began to perish. 65%, 85%, come on, 90%, 93%, so close, just a little bit more, 94%, 95%, 96%, yes, 95%, no, 90%, 85%, no, this can't be, 70%, what's happening? 60%, how is this possible? 30%, mass extinction averted. And then it dawned on us, we'd been blinded by our fears and ambitions. In our zealous desire to save the galaxy from the horrors of this world, we'd merely played a hand in fueling its evolution. Only now did we realize that with every doomed attempt, we'd in fact helped the surviving creatures adapt and evolve rapidly. We'd greatly expedited what otherwise would have taken eons. We were doomed from the start. This world's wretched goddess had lured us into her trap and played us for a fool, hook, line, and sinker. It was at this point that many began to lose hope and desert our oh-so-noble cause. Some decided to simply break rank and escape the system, while others sought refuge from the despair-inducing reality we ourselves had created by fleeing into the merciful embrace of madness. There were even a few brave fools, bless their souls, who aimed their ships at the planet, turned on their engines, and with one last prayer, flung themselves at this world made of nightmares and hate in one last act of defiance in the face of such immeasurable evil. These three plans, as well as what would eventually be dubbed the sacrifices of the foolish and foolhardy, unfolded over the span of many generations, and after a many more a brilliant scientist, my ancestor decided that enough was enough. Grand Vizier Atlaneo of the great Inalist theocracy, with the help of the High Priest, managed to convince the High Council to attempt to destroy the world of the Dark Goddess one last time. It was a genius plan, no doubt conceived through a sizable helping of divine inspiration. He theorized that there was only one way to truly destroy an entire world, by hitting it with another world. Of course, as we all know, using a piece of the great divine creation as a weapon is considered blasphemy of the highest order, which is why he opted for something similar, something world-adjacent, so to speak. And so for our last attempt at stamping out this wretched scourge, this disease upon the galaxy, our ancestors flung the largest asteroid they could find, imbued with divine energy, at the domain of the Dark Goddess. And just like that it was done. We'd been victorious at last. Surely we needn't have checked whether anything had survived. That would have been preposterous, after all, instead of facts that can be proven wrong or inventions that break we had, and we'll always have something much more potent: faith. Faith in ourselves, faith in our gods, and faith that tells us that good will always prevail over evil. And as we held faith and observed the surface of this now death and desolate rock from the comfort of our home systems, we could finally determine once and for all that the universe had been saved at last. Or at least that's what we thought, until one of the surveillance drones that the GA Gracefulness had left behind suddenly began to transmit data back to its home system. Apparently something, or rather someone, had initiated its first contact protocol. This had to be some sort of twisted joke. This simply couldn't be true. As much as we didn't want to believe it, the truth simply couldn't be denied. About 37 hours ago, surveillance drone GAG G14395105 detected the presence of a rudimentary spacecraft leaving planet GA14, thematically named after the Dark Goddess that supposedly molded and crafted said world. While our first attempts at wiping out these monsters had resulted in them adapting to said cataclysms, it seems that our latest failure resulted in them adapting not to our technology, but our minds instead. This accursed world had finally seen fit to birth creatures that could rival our intelligence and ingenuity with cunning and deceit. And now they finally managed to escape their goddess's suffocating embrace. Like the disease they are, they could finally spread themselves among the stars, and soon they would reach us. May the gods help us all. The discovery that Gaia's children had been blessed with the gift of sapience had sent shockwaves rippling throughout the entire Gamma Quadrant. While many of the Alliance's territories could live shrouded in ignorant bliss for a little while longer, as communications between quadrants could take multiple days, those unfortunate enough to share their little section of the universe with these hellworlders were forced to face the possibility that sooner or later they would have to initiate first contact with their own worst nightmares. These cosmic devils had barely left their home system, and the entire quadrant was already collectively holding its breath and preparing for the unthinkable. The royal family of the Adnian monarchy has already revised their constitution multiple times since the discovery, in an attempt at trying to avoid sending any potential heirs to the battlefield. The Quizuan's Free Democratic Republic, who I'd like to personally applaud for their pragmatism and quick thinking, are currently busy converting every single peacekeeping vessel into something that could potentially fend off the oncoming apocalypse. Then there's the HFY. As usual, no one really knows what they're up to, but my spies tell me their megaforges have been active around the clock, and the amount of pollution on their industry worlds has multiplied tenfold. And last but not least, there's us, the Annales theocracy. In the past, we've always been seen as a mighty, religious bulwark for so many lesser civilizations to cling to and hide behind. And as such, I see it as our duty, nay, our destiny, that we may help foster peace and cooperation between all species, no matter who they are, so that together we might vanquish these hellish abominations once and for all. It is to this extent that I, Grand Vizier Atlion, have decided to spearhead an initiative whereby I, the Grand Priest, and the other heads of state will gather on the GA, authoritative, one of our largest space stations, and discuss what is to be done about the newest threat knocking on the Alliance's door. With a bit of luck, we'll be able to pool our knowledge and experience together, as well as hopefully coordinate our actions in an attempt at driving these cosmic horrors back to where they came from. First and foremost, I would like to thank you all for coming. Ladies and gentlemen, I won't try to deny the severity of the situation, for as you already know, the galaxy is at the precipice of destruction. We may very well be facing the apocalypse as described in many of our sacred texts, a genuine biblical end of days, if you will. But do not despair, for as long as we, those appointed by the gods, draw breath, there is still hope. We still have divine providence on our side, and together we can fight off these monsters. Grand Vizier Atlion bellowed into his microphone as his fellow heads of state began to focus on the large orb embedded in the center of the council room, which came to life with a soft electronic hum. It opened up, and as if conjuring from thin air, it began to draw an unsettling image of some sort of bull-like abomination adorned in flames and smoke. This creature was covered in darkened scales, which seemed to crack and give way to fiery veins of smoldering magma, and its eyes burned bright with accursed hellfire. It was as if this creature had been spawned from fire and brimstone itself. Upon seeing this, all the council members, who at this point had been quietly murmuring and playing with their communicators, fell silent and started to pay attention. Senator Masella even let out a muffled shriek before trying to make herself as small as possible. "Behold a Gaian!" Possibly, the Grand Vizier yelled theatrically, knowing that he was going to have to use every trick in the book to get these reprobates to acknowledge his and his species' efforts. After all, while his kind held a lot of political and religious power, compared to the other species, they were fairly useless when it comes to combat. As you might suspect, it's pretty hard to win a fight when your entire body freezes in place at the first sign of danger. A somewhat peculiar gift they had been blessed with thanks to their deity being the god of tranquility and patience. You see, it's been about 68 hours since the Ark of Horrors was spotted, and so in preparation, I've tasked some of the theocracy's finest scientists, psychics, and analysts with studying whatever footage and research we still have left on our soon-to-be enemies. And so, as you might have already suspected, what you see here is what... "Begone, demon! Do not torture me any longer with your hideous appearance," King Hirunus commanded while plucking a handful of shiny religious artifacts from his person and dramatically jingling them at the hologram. "As I was saying," the Grand Vizier remarked, clearly annoyed by the pedantic child monarch's actions, "in the interest of preparing ourselves and our peoples for this oncoming storm, I would like to share with you every other potential form these creatures might have evolved into, as well as some of said forms' accompanying characteristics. For example, while we're not entirely sure yet what their dietary needs are, aside from souls, based on the size of this creature's claws as well as its sharp teeth, we can make an educated guess and say that it would most likely also devour flesh and bones. Although admittedly that particular type of behavior seems to be shared between most, if not all, potential forms. Which brings us to our next herald of the apocalypse. The Grand Vizier pressed a button on his communicator, and with an obnoxious click, the horned fire monster dissipated only to be replaced by what looked to be some sort of aquatic bipedal creature covered in countless tentacles, whereas the former seemed to be some sort of unholy amalgamation between a scaly furless bull and a grease fire. This new one was more akin to a giant squid person that had risen out of the deepest depths of the Mariana Trench. Once again, most of the council members cowered. This was, of course, discounting Atlion, who'd already mentally prepared himself in advance, and the Enowean representative, who was too busy familiarizing his already partially digested lunch with the council floor. You see, it's with this particular evolutionary offshoot that we began to theorize that perhaps, unlike most members of the Alliance, Gaians may be able to thrive in all sorts of environments, and not just a specific one. Now, as for our Lord Atleon, Senator Nilito started, I do not think it is necessary to subject this council nor the wider universe to this ghastly seminar. Surely most of the fighting would be done in outer space, or at the very least over large distances. As always, you strike up an excellent point, Senator, one that I and my associates will take into consideration and use to help shape these most holy proceedings in the future. Click, and with another tap of a button, the aquatic monster was replaced with yet another potential hellworlder. Over the course of the next 30 minutes, the leaders present at the council were subjected to every possible sapient creature GA-14 could have spawned. Everything from winged super lizards that could breathe fire to a mass of eyeballs embedded onto a collection of floating, intersecting rings. As time went on, all of them began to one by one take note of a certain peculiar phenomenon. It was like an itch in the back of their minds. The longer they looked at these holograms, the more uncomfortable they felt. It wasn't just fear. It was as if they were regarding something they shouldn't be allowed to look at, or perhaps something they couldn't entirely comprehend. This feeling only got worse as they reached their final potential foe. Unlike before, when a new apparition would solicit a scream or made them cower in fear, this last projection had a slightly different effect. The already fairly quiet room went completely silent as all the council members suddenly felt an unnerving tingle creep up and wash over them. Everyone collectively held their breaths as the room's temperature suddenly seemed to drop, and everyone became very aware of their own mortality. They felt uncomfortable, perhaps even watched, as if this projection had somehow summoned the creature which shape it resembled. It was as if a long and dark gloomy shadow was suddenly cast over the entire room, and all these men and women who'd once proudly pronounced themselves protected by the gods felt like a prey being stalked by a predator, as if their gods had betrayed them and fled, leaving them to fend for themselves. Like all the other horrors before, this one looked creepy, unnatural, and positively horrifying. But there was more to it than that. This thing, it had some kind of alluring mystique. There wasn't just fear there. It was also, well, a little exciting, like a kid feeling giddy about doing something they weren't supposed to. This made it so that while every fiber of their being told them to look away, that this thing was pure evil and would corrupt them, somehow they couldn't. They had stared into the abyss, and now it was staring back at them. Like many before, this was yet another biped. It had 2 front-facing eyes, a patch of hair on top of its head, and 4 primary limbs with which it could grasp, fight, and/or flight. It was presumably only slightly larger than the galactic average and didn't sport any natural weapons that were immediately obvious, aside from perhaps their sturdy endoskeleton and noticeable muscle mass. Of course, this no doubt would bolster the belief that Gaians most likely use their cunning in tandem with latent psychic powers to survive and perhaps even claim dominion of a small piece of their homeworld. Minutes passed by as the council members felt their sanity slowly slip away while trying to wrestle themselves free from this abomination's alluring visage. In the end, it was Ital, the Enowayan representative, who managed to reach for his blaster, and with one precise shot, ended the presentation. Everyone all right? Everyone still has their soul? Hirunas, the young monarch, asked before softly mumbling a prayer. I think that's about enough for today. Let's just wrap things up and continue tomorrow. The Grand Vizier said before turning to the staff present in the council room and impressing upon them his desire to keep everything they'd seen just now a secret. His men had informed him that some of these renders, and especially the last one, might have adverse effects on people's psyche, but he'd never expected anything like this. Great. Yet another problem to tackle in the near future, as if I didn't have my hands full already, he thought to himself. And just like that, everyone left. No one complained or retorted. After all, it seemed that trying to peer past the veil and at these Gaians had taken a toll on the esteemed leaders of the quadrant. They were all pretty shaken up and battered emotionally. More than anything, they just wanted to retreat back to their rooms, and for at least a little while pretend that none of this had ever happened. Later that evening, Grand Vizier Atleon would find himself sitting behind his study desk, reassessing the day's proceedings. It had all gone so smoothly right up until... Uncle Addy! Uncle Addy! Atleon looked up to see his niece Adnata barge into his office. Look, I'm a Gaian, Bleer! The young Inalis ran up to her uncle and proudly twirled around, showing off her costume. Unfortunately for Atleon, the young girl was part of the small yet vocal minority that had seen the discovery of these Gaians as an exciting development instead of the incomprehensible nightmare that it really was, which is why Adnata had sought fit to, once again, glue a couple of homemade tentacles to her fluffy wool, donned a pair of fake horns and fangs before seeking out her favorite uncle. "That looks great, sweetie, but I'm afraid I'm a little busy at the—" "And?" she interrupted him. And what?" he asked. "And well, do I look like them? Like a Gaian?" Oh, well, you see, we're not exactly sure yet. Look, we're trying our best, okay? Just let Uncle Addy sort this stuff out, and when I'm done, I'll come and visit you and show you some of the stuff the lab coats have been working on. All right? I promise this won't take long." "All right, promise. But you better not forget like last time," she said before leaving just as hastily as she'd arrived. As soon as she left, Atleon let out a deep sigh, his facial features hardened into a pensive stare, tinted with sadness, aimed at an old family picture on the far left corner of his desk. "I'm not sure what frightens me more, brother. The fact that she too has found herself mesmerized by that cursed planet, or that with each passing day she reminds me more and more of you." "Good day, everyone. May the gods be with you," Atleon exclaimed jovially as the council members entered the circular room, took their seats and responded in kind. It seemed that all of them had returned aside from the young monarch who had sought fit to send a doppelganger in his stead. Such hubris, thinking sly old Atleon wouldn't notice. Then again, maybe it would have worked if said doppelganger hadn't been at least 10 years the Child King's senior. Perhaps he should confront him about his absence later. Regardless, there's no use in pondering such trivial matters right now, for it seems that the Enowayan representative has something he'd like to share with the council. At which point, the teddy bear-like alien turned on his podium's microphone and began to address the room. Just as the Analis have managed to make some potentially accurate predictions regarding the nature of these Gaians, we too have taken the initiative to try and uncover their secrets. Although having said that, I must admit that we haven't been nearly as successful yet. You see, the discovery of these Hellworlders has given us the rare opportunity to field test a new type of ship, one we've equipped with several exciting new modules, some of which allow us to study their planet and listen in on their radio communications from a relatively safe distance, as opposed to older, cruder, and not to mention more easily detectable methods. In that case, am I correct in assuming that you've already learned something interesting you'd like to share with the class? Atleon curiously asked, to which the Enowayan hesitantly nodded in response. You see, we've been running their communications through various translation algorithms, but something doesn't seem quite right. So far, we haven't been able to make much progress at all. It's like their language keeps changing with every message we intercept. Even our most esteemed linguists just can't seem to make heads or tails of it. According to them, their language is a total mess and horribly inconstant. One second it sounds like a tranquil river that smoothly courses past their lips, and another it's more akin to a roaring fire being spat out. My God, the Hiruna's look-alike chimes in. Don't you see? They've somehow figured out that you've been spying on them and are now modifying their language accordingly. They're even more cunning than we thought. At which point the entire council room bursts into a panic. Oh gods, they probably already know where we are. One of the mushroom-like senators yells out before bursting into tears, which is followed by the Enowayan representative, who once again refuses to keep down his breakfast. In the meantime, the supposed king's entourage protectively surround their fake monarch while Atleon freezes in place. Being the cunning politician that he is, Alteon made sure to try and keep his expression neutral. Even if the rest of his body succumbed to his species' fear response, he could still trick the others into thinking he'd remained calm and collected while they were busy despairing and wallowing in self-pity. Esteemed members of the council, please calm down, Atleon exclaimed as soon as he started to regain control of his body again. This is exactly what they want us to think. That is, if they're all that interested in finding us in the first place. Keep in mind the last attack on their planet was executed millions of years ago, We're not even sure whether they're specifically looking for revenge or set on mindlessly spreading their corruption. Therefore, I propose that as long as they don't venture out of their system, we bide our time, gather resources, and stay the hell away until we've got the entire galaxy united and armed to the teeth. Yeah, about that, the Enowayan interjected. You know how we just mentioned that we're spying on their homeworld from a relatively safe distance, he said while emphasizing the word relatively. Define, stay the hell away from. The Grand Vizier rested his face in his hands while letting out a loud, drawn-out sigh. All right, how close? About 2 light years, more or less, the Enowayan responded. From their system? Their planet. Ah, shit, Atleon muttered softly under his breath. While under normal circumstances, 2 light years would have been more than acceptable. Considering the nature of the looming threat, he wasn't sure whether it was worth the risk. Sure, they'd be able to learn a lot, but if caught, these Gaians would probably use torture, assimilation, or manage to somehow physically extract whatever information they needed out of the crew. At which point they'd know exactly where to come and look for the rest of the civilized universe. No, we can't gamble away our people's lives like this. We aren't like those monsters. We're civilized. Once the council meeting has concluded, I'll be sure to privately confront the Enowayan on the matter and discourage the continuation of said mission. Gods, I'm such an idiot. Reka let out a sigh before slumping forwards onto her desk. There she was on a Spectre-class recon vessel, the newest, most advanced recon ship the Enowayan Confederacy has ever produced. Or so they'd claimed. She couldn't believe she'd actually taken the job. They lured her in with false promises of excitement, honor, and recognition, but in reality, all it had been was equal parts dull boredom and nervous fright. On one hand, she was stuck in a cloaked ship in the middle of cousin-fuck nowhere, while on the other, as the ship's resident xenologist, she was tasked with studying all she could about these Gaians, which combined with her proximity to their homeworld, made her deeply afraid. What's more, it appears that the threat these creatures pose may have been somewhat understated. After all, it seems they're already in the middle of spreading their infernal corruption. As everyone knows, only the gods can create and shape worlds. For anyone else to try and simulate their divine craftsmanship was heresy of the highest order. Back home, the insinuation alone would be fought with ridicule and condescension. And yet there they were, building domed settlements on that red barren hellscape. Based on some of our sensors' readings, it appears that they were slowly assimilating it and turning it into yet another world for their dark goddess. Gods, will this be the fate of the entire galaxy if we don't stop them? Will all our cradle worlds get corrupted and turned into more Gaian hive worlds? The thought alone made her shudder and wince. No, I can't let them get into my head like that. The entire universe may be at stake. I should focus and finish my report as soon as possible. The rate at which they're expanding and advancing technologically may be way beyond our initial predictions. I have to send my findings to the council as soon as possible. She suddenly got interrupted by what had to be the vile machinations of the dark goddess. Out of nowhere and without warning, the lights turned off, followed by various shrieks and cries for help reverberating from deeper within the ship. "Oh gods, what is it now?" she asked with annoyed frustration tinging her voice. The Enowayan made her way to the hall where she was confronted by a small contingent of engineers, one of which was now shining a flashlight right into her face. "Ma'am, please stay in your room. There's been a problem with the ship's power supply. Don't worry, it's nothing major, but due to the curious nature of the issue, it might take a couple minutes for the backup reactor to turn on," the lead engineer informed her before he and his team took off again. Reka wanted to trust the engineer's words. This was most likely just a small issue stemming from the fact that the Confederacy had hurriedly slapped together various experimental systems onto a recon vessel with very little regard for power management protocols. Taking into account the threat these Gaians could pose, such a theory seemed fairly reasonable. But what if that wasn't the case? What if, just like with the extermination fleets, Gaia had lured us here and now, that we're in her sphere of influence, she'd no longer let us go? No, I can't think like that, she chastised herself. Falling into despair like that won't solve anything. I'm sure that an automatic distress call has already... Oh no. A certain realization hit her like a bus. Whenever an Alliance vessel has a major systems malfunction, like for example a power outage, an automatic distress call will be sent out. A distress call that's easy to detect and powerful enough to reach civilized space. Of course, what the designers of said safety protocol hadn't taken into account was the potential proximity of a reality-ending scourge of hyper-adaptive, voracious horrors who might actually be able to pick up on said signal. Gods, what should I do? What can I do? What if they actually manage to reach us? Would they simply eat us, suck out our souls? What if they can assimilate us somehow or instead use us to find our home systems? Intelligence-wise, they're supposedly on par with the rest of the universe after all. Before the young Enowayan could give herself a headache from overthinking so much, the lights suddenly turned back on, followed by a chime and the captain's calming voice. Good day, everyone. May the gods be with you. I, first and foremost, on behalf of the Alliance and the great Enowayan Confederacy, would like to apologize for the slight inconvenience. Rest assured, everything is fine, and there's no need to panic, but unfortunately, we will be stranded here for a little while longer. So with that being said, would everyone please gather in the cafeteria for a head count and for us to clarify certain unfortunate circumstances we find ourselves in? Thank you. Most of the crew had already made themselves comfortable by the time Rika arrived at the cafeteria. Luckily, she wouldn't have to wait for long, seeing as the GA Subtlety was a relatively small vessel with only a crew of about 70 people. A few minutes later, once everyone had been accounted for, the captain got on top of one of the tables and began to address the crew directly. Unfortunately, to everyone's dismay, Rika's theory had been correct. While one of the engineers had been quick to manually force an unexpected shutdown using only a wrench and some elbow grease, it was apparently already too late. The ship had sent out an automatic distress signal that, if picked up, the Gaians could use to track down their ship. As the captain had no doubt expected, the crew began to panic. Some pointed fingers and accused others of being saboteurs and traitors while trying to leave the now locked room prematurely, while others focused their fears inward and began to give in to whatever their body's favored response was to having just been told that they might get hunted down and ripped apart by a race of Lovecraftian horrors. Everyone, please, don't lose hope, the captain bellowed. The chance that we should meet such a dire fate is fairly small. There's still a decent chance that they won't understand or will simply dismiss the signal, or perhaps we'll get rescued before those things find us. Keep in mind, while scary, they're still fairly primitive. So even if they reach us, there are still a few things we can do to defend ourselves. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to have the Chief of Security unlock the doors. We're all going to retreat to our quarters in an orderly fashion. And in about 4 hours, once everyone's had the chance to calm down and regain their senses, we're going to reconvene at the armory and we're going to prepare for whatever may happen. Don't worry. I know things may seem hopeless, but I'm sure that together we can get through this. Now then, who's with me? Come on, hurry. I don't want to be late. Senny yelled while dragging her friend along through the space station's crowded plaza. Can't you at least slow down a little? If I'd known we'd be running, I would have worn different shoes, Adnata retorted while trying to keep up with her manic, Adnian friend. Eventually, the two of them found themselves in front of a doorway that had been crudely decorated with a pair of black bed sheets. Some printed out pictures of cosmic monsters, as well as a large homemade banner that read, Gaia's Secret Children. I'm pretty sure you guys aren't allowed to just claim one of the station's rooms like that, Adnata informed her friend. Oh, come now. Half the station isn't in use right now. A station created at the behest of your uncle, if memory serves me right. Plus, if they knew what we're doing here, they'd admonish us either way, so just relax for a change. Everything will be fine. You'll see. Senny tried to put her friend's mind at ease before lifting one of the bed sheets and dragging her inside. Once inside, Adnata was greeted by the sight of two Quizuans and another Inalis. The female Quizuan was writing something down on her communicator, while the two guys were busy drawing a creature with a frightening amount of tentacles and teeth. Adnata was about to introduce herself when the female Quizuan looked up and jovially addressed her. Oh shit, you're finally here. We were starting to think that Senny had either made you up or was selfishly keeping you all to herself. At which point, the two boys laid down their pencils and rushed over to go and greet their aspiring cult's newest member. After they'd all gotten the chance to introduce themselves, Seni took it upon herself to kick off this week's club meeting. She got up on one of the tables and began to address her fellow harbingers of doom. "Mwahaha! Good day, everyone, and may the dark goddess watch over us," she said after donning a black cape with a comically large collar and laughing evilly. At which point the other members followed Seni's lead and began to dress up in manner that befits the supposed followers of Gaia. Adnata was glad she always brought her cardboard horns and fangs wherever she went. Otherwise, she'd sure look quite foolish right about now. "Now then," Sonny started while grinning wickedly, "seeing as we've got a new member joining us today, a new initiate who's ready to stand against those who defy us, another lost child who's ready to accept her place beneath the mistress of madness, the lady of lies, the dame of destra—" Yeah, get on with it already, would ya?" Colette, the female quizwin, interrupted her. "As I was saying, my best friend, Adnata is joining us today," at which point she made a little heart with her fingers at her. "And to commemorate this joyous occasion, we will be feasting on the flesh of the innocent." Seni went and grabbed a platter she'd hidden in one of the room's empty closets, before dropping it on the table she'd just stood on. "In case you were wondering, yes, they contain the souls of our enemies," the Atnian proudly proclaimed with a mischievous giggle. Apparently, the would-be priestess and pastry chef had prepared what looked like moist, fleshy bread pudding, like buns covered in some sort of thick red sauce that obviously was meant to look like blood. The group looked kind of nervous, seeing as to their innocent, herbivorous eyes, the clumsily made pastries looked somewhat like real meat. "Wait a minute, didn't you make these with that fake meat recipe on the Gaian fan forum? I remember a couple posts on the hot page that showed off suspiciously similar treats." How about shush and cannibalize your lessers, my fellow spawn of destruction and chaos?" Seni retorted while stuffing one of her desserts into the snitch's mouth. The 5 members of Gaia's cutest cult began to eat the strange yet delicious treats while casually talking among themselves. Each of them had at least 1 or 2 stories to tell about their supposed encounters with a cosmic horrors, after which they bonded over the way their parents would admonish them for being somewhat slightly obsessed with horror and the unknown. Although, to be fair, who wouldn't get bored with the stale, stagnant monotony of the known universe? Everything's safe, regulated, and micromanaged to the point where nothing exciting ever happens. Or at least that's how things used to be. If there's anything they all agree on, it's that those Gaians would shake things up and finally change things for the better, which to them sounded like a dream come true. After all, being on the GA authoritative meant that the parents of these youngsters were at the very least pretty high up in the social hierarchy, which to each of them meant that, even more so than regular people, their lives were constantly being controlled, micromanaged, and made mind-numbingly boring without them being able to do anything about it. Something quickly proven by the sight of one of Seni's maids popping her head through the entrance's bedsheets. Upon seeing the 5 tiny would-be cultists eating what to her must have looked like flesh and blood, the stuffy-looking maid's expression instantly turned into one of confused shock. Her leathery skin turned increasingly pale as she threw up her hands as if to say, "I'm not even gonna bother with this shit," and she quickly power-walked the fuck out of there. The maid's expeditious retreat was accompanied by the sound of muffled giggles and laughter, as most of them were still in the middle of eating Seni's delicious pastries. Back on the GA, Subtlety, the captain and his crew were busy barricading the bridge while waiting for the inevitable, or at least the 20 or so who'd bothered to show up. Everyone else was undoubtedly either in their rooms, quietly sobbing and trying to accept their fate, or hiding somewhere in the hopes that the Gaians wouldn't find them. The captain had to admit, though, after one of the navigators had detected the Gaians' metallic abominations cruising towards us about an hour ago, he'd almost joined those cowardly fools in their prayers while hiding himself in the ship's cargo hold. Luckily for his mortal soul, his sense of duty managed to overtake his cold, calculating desire for survival. Even if his resolve had almost slipped, at least he wasn't one of the few sniveling traitors who'd instead decided to try and appease those abominations by praying to them and their petty excuse for a deity. Not long after, the captain was pulled from his thoughts by the chief security officer announcing the arrival of the Gaians. They jumped to their general location not too long ago and had now finally reached their vessel. Unfortunately for them, their backup generator would only power the most essential modules, which to these self-titled pacifists now meant that they had nothing to fire at the Gaians with. There was no doubt anymore. Those things were hell-bent on destroying us. For the last 10 minutes leading up to their arrival, they'd sought fit to bombard our communication systems with all manner of strange signals and undecipherable madness. They were undoubtedly trying to somehow mess with our systems, or at the very least our nerves. With only seconds to spare, the chief engineer finally managed to remotely overload one of the breakers responsible for keeping the lights on, which should give us at least a little bit more time. Not long after we felt it, the entire ship shook. They'd somehow brute forced themselves through one of the airlocks, and were probably in the midst of boarding us as we speak. May the gods save us all. Fuck this, fuck that, fuck everything, and most importantly, fuck my life, Reka angrily hissed to herself while clumsily running around the ship's darkened hallways. Her indecisiveness had caused her to waste too much time looking for a suitable hiding spot, and now, with no time left and the lights out, once again, she was forced to wander around looking for literally any place to hide. Eventually, she ended up wandering into the medbay just in time, as at the end of the hallway she could hear someone violently tearing open the doors to the medical ward. Hello? Anyone there? We picked up your distress signal. Is everything okay? Rika nearly let out a scream as the cosmic entity's growls and grunts confirmed her worst fears, as well as re-emphasized how close she was to dying a horrific death, or worse. No doubt it was taunting and ridiculing her with what soon would be her fate, in the hopes she'd somehow understand its incomprehensible language. She quickly hid in one of the closets but left it slightly ajar. If she was about to die anyways, she at least wanted to know what this supposed harbinger of doom looked like. Of course, fate had sought fit to screw her over yet again, as the Gaian had apparently donned some sort of combat armor that covered its entire body. It was completely white sleek, and based on the sound of its footsteps, she guessed it was fairly heavy, even though the Gaian was walking around as if it weighed nothing. Please don't find me. Please don't find me. She softly prayed to herself while trying not to burst out in tears. It was slowly getting closer. Any second now, it would open the closet doors and do unspeakable things to her. Fuck it! She couldn't take it anymore, she yelled before bursting out of her hiding spot like a space bat out of space hell. She tried to push past the armored Gaian, but almost immediately lost her footing and fell to the floor before trying to scramble away as quickly as possible, knocking over a couple trays holding surgical equipment in the process. The Gaian, on the other hand, let out a loud scream of his own and took a step back before tripping over a box full of medical supplies. As soon as the two frightened chucklefucks managed to somewhat come to their senses, they noticed that in their panicked state, they'd knocked over a lot of dangerous and sharp medical equipment, like, for example, laser scalpels, dental drills, and other pointy surgical thingamabobs. Rika was the first to react, and with nothing left to lose, went on the offensive. She began by heroically and mercilessly pelting the Gaian with various pill bottles and crumpled-up doctor's note, to which the Gaian reacted by whipping her with an unwound bandage before grabbing a pillow from one of the nearby beds and throwing it at her face. It took an embarrassing 5 minutes for the both of them to realize that neither alien had any intention to harm the other, at which point the entire room was practically covered in enough scattered pills to make a junkie forever disavow the 5-second rule. After their valiant battle and an awkward silence, the Enowayan was the first to act. She wasn't sure why she did what she did, other than the fact that there was little else she could think of to do. But nevertheless, she stuck out her hand as if politely greeting an old friend, and to her astonishment, the Gaian seemed to know exactly what that meant, as it just as quickly reached out and interlocked her hand with his own. With amicable relations established, both creatures cautiously got up while making sure not to take their eyes off of each other, at which point Raka slowly took a few steps towards the door before sprinting away from there as quickly as possible. While this Gaian had seemed to be completely unlike what the holy text had described, there was no way of knowing what its intentions were. For all she knew, it was just luring her into a false sense of security or an anomaly among its own kind. Either way, there was no way she was risking sticking around to find out. Once again, Rika made her way through the darkened halls of the ship in search for a better place to hide. Perhaps if she made it back to her room, she could simply barricade it and wait things out. She thought to herself before her train of thought suddenly got interrupted by the sight of two nervous-looking crew members beckoning her closer. They were standing in the doorway of one of the operating rooms while fidgeting frantically. One of them was clearly dressed as a security officer, while she recalled that the other worked at the hydroponics bay. "Psst! We just found the perfect hiding spot. If you hurry, we'll let you join us," the security officer whispered at her, while his friend was using a flashlight to keep an eye on both sides of the hallway. Seeing no reason not to trust them, Rika hurriedly ran over to the two of them. As soon as Rika stepped inside, she felt one of them try to tackle her to the ground. Being a researcher, she'd never really cared much for physical fitness, and quickly found herself overpowered with her arms restrained behind her back, at which point her assailant's accomplice began to tie her up. "Wait, let me go. What are you doing?" she asked with tears staining the corners of her eyes. "I'm sorry, but this is our only chance," the horticulturalist mumbled nervously as the security officer picked up the squirming girl. "You've got the blood?" he asked while turning to his partner in crime. She nodded quietly and held up a bunch of blood bags. "All right, you know the plan. Let's go." Rika struggled and tried to kick them, but alas, her captors had tied her up pretty tightly, and there was no way she could properly wind up a kick while being dragged by tied-up ankles over the cold, hard ground. Thunk, thunk, thunk. "Wait!" Thunk, thunk, thunk. She heard something reverberate through the ship's icy metallic floors. Something was running towards them, something heavy. "The Gaian must have followed me," she thought to herself. "Well, fuck it. It's not like I've got any better ideas." She mentally braced herself, sucked in a large breath of air before yelling out to the hulking beast as loud as she could. "Help!" The thumping of its feet became louder and louder, just as the interval between each step shortened. It had heard her plea for help, and even though they spoke two completely different languages, sensed her distress. It was closing in on them. Her captors could hear it now as well. They tensed up at first, but quickly recovered. The former security officer managed to steel his nerves and encourage his partner to do the same. "Just keep running. We'll be safe once we reach the Tetrut seeds. It won't be able to get us, and the seeds' holy properties will stop the creature's soul magic. Then all we'll have to do is begin the ritual. But whatever you do, don't look into its eyes, or else it'll take control of your mind." "Wait, I thought it used those to turn people to stone?" she retorted through labored breaths. "Don't be ridiculous, that stuff only happens in fairy tales." They managed to drag Rika to the cafeteria just in time to where they'd set up a large circle of the aforementioned seeds. With little care for her safety, the two miscreants left her outside of the holy herb barrier, and were delighted to see that the beast was being repelled by its divine power. It had stopped right in front of their sacrifice, not because it didn't wish to harm her, but obviously due to the magical properties of space oregano. The glorified farmhand began to chant, "O great Gaia, mother of all that is cursed, vanquisher of the righteous, please, we beg of thee, accept this humble sacrifice and grant us control of this child of yours, so we may do thy bidding and spread thine faith. All we ask in return is to be spared. And maybe some cool Gaian powers," the former security officer added as the two of them began to one by one open up the blood bags before throwing them at their unwilling sacrifice, covering her in blood. Rika was shuddering and shaking heavily, but right as the two would-be cultists were opening another bag, the hulking monstrosity cut them off by walking straight through their holy barrier. I don't think it worked," the former horticulturalist, now self-taught detective, whispered to her friend, at which point each of them turned pale and took a frightened step back before attempting to run away. But as luck would have it, among a couple other things, Gaians are blessed with a keen regard for rules and regulations, whenever it suits their needs, of course. And among Gaians, no rule is more well-known than the one that pertains to what happened when one fucks around. So with an overabundance of righteous fury and an underabundance of care for interspecies diplomacy, it punched one of them in the back of the head before drop-kicking the other across the room. Actually, no, scratch that. The most well-known rule is obviously the 34th. But after careful consideration in the sight of the three oddly proportioned Care Bears, covered in what must have been liters of blood, he thought less of it. With the two would-be cultists taken care of, and his adventurous spirit adequately dampened, the large armored alien took hold of a now drenched and shaking Rekka before Princess carrying her to safety. Back on the bridge, the captain and his 20 bravest crew members were anxiously going through the ship's live security feed. On one hand, they were hoping that the Gaians wouldn't find and butcher too many of their colleagues, and on the other, they had to admit that they were kind of curious as to what these creatures looked and behaved like. Luckily, to their relief, it appeared that most encounters between Enowayan and cosmic horror ended without any bloodshed. Sometimes a Gaian would be seen hurriedly walking up to an Enowayan before frantically caressing the top of its fuzzy head, obviously in order to judge the quality of its fur and whether it could make a nice coat out of it, while other times a Gaian might let out some sort of loud war shriek before running away, no doubt to gather its packmates. Then again, perhaps its predator honor simply wouldn't accept an easy hunt. On other occasions, humans could be seen whipping out strange electronic devices before menacingly aiming them their mortified victims. We assumed that these were some kind of barbaric projectile launchers, but upon further inspection, it seemed that said devices were merely meant for visual research gathering. In other words, they were taking pictures. Goddamn pictures. What the hell world is wrong with these Gaians? The captain bellowed. What kind of trickery is his? Why do they keep toying with us? Are they going to kill us or what? Is this all just a game to them? The same events kept repeating itself throughout the following hour. Gaians and Enowayans would encounter one another, shenanigans ensue, followed by the captain, and to a lesser extent the crew members who decided to follow him, getting more and more anxious at the cosmic horror's pacifistic charade. Even those who'd accepted their fate and walked up to the creatures, or God forbid fell to their knees in front of them, were spared, at times even given a head pat. Oh God, what if they're trying to invade our minds? What if they're waiting for the opportune time to strike? What if they're somehow slowly sucking out our souls simply by being on our ship? The Enowayans yelled in turn as they tried to figure out what the hell was going on. What if they're here to have their way with us and implant us with their eggs? One of the otherwise quiet engineers theorized a little bit too loudly, to which the rest of the crew took a generous step away from him, after which they glared at him judgingly. Of course, it didn't help our potential pervert's case that he seemed to have also forgotten to load his photon rifle. Just a theory, Private Galeth mumbled quietly, while dejectedly drooping his head and shoulders as an intense feeling of shame and regret washed over him. It seemed that for some strange reason, these Gaians were content with just observing and interacting with us, and upon satisfying whichever primal instinct had led them to such a puzzling course of action from what should have been a world-ending threat, they'd just leave, usually after excitedly jumping up and down while yelling something in their native tongue. While certainly odd, such behavior did not warrant any wild theories and outlandish speculation regarding the nature of these beings, or at least it didn't right until they saw one such monster saving their xenologist from two crazed cultists, carrying her to one of the bedded rooms in the medical ward and bandaging her cuts and bruises. Don't be fooled, it must have somehow figured out we're watching it and is merely trying to lure us out, the captain said upon seeing some of his men's resolve falter. But then what about the other ones? They haven't attacked anyone else either. One of the linguists exclaimed, to which some of his peers seemed to nod in agreement. Wait a minute, the captain whispered. That's it! Don't you see? That's it! What's it, Captain? Did you just think of a way to get us out of this mess? Potentially. Look, I know what I'm about to say will sound strange, but bear with me here. We have holy blood. Okay, I guess, and how'd you figure that? Think about it. Whenever they encounter us, they just can't seem to bring themselves to harm us. Obviously, they tried to, but something was stopping them. And then there was that xenologist, Riata, or whatever her name was. She was covered from head to toe in blood, and it basically treated her like a helpless newborn. So like our blood deters cosmic horrors? One of the navigators asked. Yes, and it charms them, the captain added proudly, to which, from the other side of the room, Private Galeth could be heard letting out an invigorated, "Yees!" this time unbothered by the various glares of disgust aimed at him. "Well, I hope you're right, Captain, 'cause I fear shit's about to go down," one of the engineers remarked as the large monitor revealed how 3 armored Gaians were heading toward the bridge. "Would you like for us to go and unbarricade the door so you can go and test out your theory? Maybe offer them some biscuits and tea?" "Screw that! Keep that door fucking shut!" While the creature still gave her the creeps, Reika had to admit that after what had just happened, she'd be much more scared without her big armored protector. After it had bandaged her up, the two of them sat together in silence, staring at one another, as if mesmerized by each other's existence. This would not last long, of course, for not even a minute or so later, they were suddenly caught off guard by a loud chime coming from the creature's wrist. Its head drooped, as if saddened. Apparently, it knew that its time with its new alien friend had come to an end. The Gaian reached over to the device, pressed a button at which point the frightening voice of yet another cosmic horror could be heard emanating from it. It sounded in hurry and somewhat nervous, which roused her new friend into action. As it sprinted out of the room and through the hallways, Reika felt conflicted. Her instincts told her to be relieved, that what she had assumed was a monster was leaving. But the more rational part of her mind felt saddened and lonely. While she'd been distrustful of it at first, the creature truly seemed kind and excited to be around her. It hadn't shown the slightest bit of hostility, or well, it didn't, right until those morons tried to kidnap her. Surely a truly wicked creature wouldn't be able to put up such a convincing performance without slipping up even once, right? The dark goddess was cunning, but surely not that patient. "Ugh, screw it!" she exclaimed with a loud, drawn-out sigh before heading off in the direction the creature had gone into. Almost precisely at what most species on the GA authoritative considered to be midnight, an automated distress signal followed by a less automated, way more distress signal had been intercepted by one of the frontier worlds and was subsequently forwarded to the quadrant's official base of operations. Which of course meant that all the council members had to be roused from their sleep and escorted to the council room as quickly as possible. This, as you might expect, led to certain but interesting developments. For one, either Atleon was seeing double, or both the Adnian monarch as well as his body double had arrived at the meeting, not knowing that the other would attend as well. Of course, the young monarch had a simple explanation, for you see, this look-alike was merely an evil clone, who, as evil clones are often known to do, immediately agreed with his accuser, called himself a dastardly rascal before letting himself get handcuffed and carried out of the room. Atleon had almost found it funny if not for a third Hirunas to walk in not 2 minutes later. Not wanting to get drawn into even more courtly intrigue, the Grand Vizier began to mentally recite his talking points, trying to ignore the other panicked heads of state. Most of all his political rival, the esteeming piece of shit Grand Priest Edion. Whereas Atleon could be described as rather stout and fair, perhaps a tiny bit opportunistic, his co-ruler Edion was his polar opposite. Lanky, conniving, and if Atleon knew what a snake was, he'd probably liken and wish to feed him to one. One might ponder why Edion hadn't been ousted from his post as a religious figurehead ages ago on the grounds of laziness and a general lack of respect. After all, he practically sleeps through the entire workday, only to then spend the night attending lavish parties and enjoying himself. At first one might blame corruption or nepotism, accusations that wouldn't be entirely without merit. But more so than anything else, Edion's just a very annoying and dangerous combination of charismatic, clever, and ruthless. Whatever work the theocracies, diplomats, and politicians might get done during the day, Edion would easily surpass them at night at said celebratory events. The following day, he'd merely need to point out who he'd talked to the night before, and then the only thing that the theocracy's diplomats would need to do is make things official with a polite nod and a scribble. It was a fairly good system, at least as long as they could remember to warn the interns against waking him up prematurely. Otherwise, he'd oversleep and no one wanted to have to pay him overtime. Having had enough of everyone's insistent bickering and convoluted accusations, Atleon finally couldn't take it anymore and yelled for everyone to be quiet already. Everyone undoubtedly already knew what had happened. We're all stressed and tired, so then why the hell do these childish sycophants feel the need to further add fuel to the proverbial fire. Atleon thought to himself angrily. That wasn't me. That was the gods. He stammered nervously after almost losing his cool there for a second. With everyone finally quiet, Atleon officially started the emergency council meeting. Honored members of the council, guests to this humble station, and representatives of the people's interests. Today, fate has once again dealt us a crippling blow. Atleon continued to inform the rest of the council about the concerning news regarding the Enowean's oh-so-high-tech ship that was no doubt already in the hands of the Dark Goddess. This is a travesty, a tragedy. We must send a fleet of those new warships. They're not ready yet and might not even be all that effective against the Gaians. We shouldn't provoke them. No, hide! We should just cut off all contact and pray they won't find us. That's ridiculous. How long do you think we'd be able to keep that up? Once again, fueled by fear and desperation, the council members began to argue and bicker among themselves. Or at least they did until a shrill, high-pitched voice stood out above the rest. Maybe things need not be so difficult. The second representative of the analysis seat of power remarked, perhaps these Gaians have a very different part to play in the galaxy's future affairs other than what might appear most evident. Perhaps you've all been looking at things all wrong. What the hell are you on about this time, Edion? Atleon asked dryly. Oh, come. Do you all seriously not see the opportunity that's right in front of us? Over the last few millennia, some of our constituents have grown difficult, displeased with the way of the world, and now thanks to these Gaians, dissenting voices have made themselves known. All while those still loyal have been invigorated with renewed fervor and zealous admiration towards us and the prestigious gods we serve. These Gaians have reminded the universe why we're here, why we, the gods' representatives, were chosen. Those who were progressively losing their way and faith in our rule have in one swift motion seen the error of their ways and returned to the flock, while those too far gone to be saved are practically on the cusp of becoming a cautionary tale. Don't you all see? Are you all blind? There are counterbalance, yet so far behind technologically. We can use that, and more importantly, we can use them. Which is why I've taken the liberty of intercepting and dealing with any and all troublesome information that might otherwise find its way past the quadrant's borders. Admittedly, I can't entirely stop the rumor mill, but I can at least manipulate how fast it spins. In fact, I'd wager I'm pretty adept at dampening revolutions if I say so myself. He mused ominously while staring at the other representatives with an expression of childlike glee plastered on his bonny visage. Are you seriously suggesting we use the Dark Goddess children to keep our people in line? One of the Quizinian senators asked incredulously. Well, why not? We've technically been doing it since forever already. Telling our children to behave, or the horned one will find them. Telling non-believers to start praying, or they'll get sent to the world of the Dark Goddess. Only difference now is that we've got coordinates and some rather invigorating visual stimulants to accompany these life lessons we wish to impart onto our flock. Look, just send a couple PKVs, peacekeeping vessels, to go retrieve whatever still remains of the subtlety, and I'll do the rest. Eventually, whenever I feel like it, that is. The archpriest said mid-yawn. No, we must send an entire fleet and strike back. They can't think we're weak and cowardly, one of the senators yelled. First and foremost, we must send a theocratic vessel to guide the souls of the subtlety's crew to the afterlife. What if they left the ship's wreck after slaughtering the crew? Our people have paid a heavy price to have it built and manned as quickly as it was. That ship was proof of our commitment and sense of solidarity, so therefore I'd argue we should be allowed to go and retrieve whatever's left of it. Oh, because your first expedition went so well, the archpriest remarked mockingly, to which the offended Enowean huffed with righteous indignation. Wait, one of the two Atnean monarchs yelled. Whereas yesterday's doppelganger had already been promoted to evil clone and escorted out of the room, this third Hirunas seemed much more convincing in regards to their looks as well as age, although they still appeared to be a few years older than the original. Perhaps we don't need to resort to violence just yet. Perhaps we can study them and make videos and, watch later and learn from them. The third Hirunas mumbled and stuttered, while rapidly losing confidence as the various council members were regarding the fake king with puzzled, judgmental expressions, seemingly staring a hole straight through their soul, or at least that must have been what it felt like. Psst, sis, what are you doing? Does this have anything to do with those weird forums Dad caught you browsing the other day? Shush, Mom said it would be my turn to be king today. The disguised sister chastised her younger brother. Look, I know what I'm doing. Just wait and stay quiet, okay? Or just leave. I know what I'm doing, I promise. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me that while the Adnian as well as the Inowayan representative might not agree with the spirit of my suggestion, I do believe that our interests align in such a way where neither party would be inconvenienced by a cooperative venture. Edion pondered aloud while absent-mindedly fidgeting with one of his many rings. Ah, shit. This is what I'd feared. To Atleon's horror, it seemed that factions were forming within the council. That fool Edion, what's he doing? Can't he see that now more than ever we should be united? Atleon thought to himself. I suppose, as usual, it falls on me to compromise and help mediate the situation in order to maintain the council's cohesion. In that case, Alteon began, seeing as you're all so excited to venture out towards GA-14 yet again, how about this? Every race gets to prepare up to 3 vessels, one of which a PKV, and together as one fleet, they'll make their way to the Dark Goddess's domain to secure their respective races' interests, whatever those may be. Now, if the Gaians do show up or are suspected of being close by, it's up to each race to individually decide whether they'd like to flee or take military action. And last but not least, if anything goes wrong, we cut our losses and wash our hands of the situation. We can't let ourselves get suckered into wasting vast amounts of resources and manpower just to save rescue parties that were meant to save previous rescue parties. It's settled then, Edion cheerfully exclaimed as everyone appeared to accept Atleon's plan. I don't know about you lot, but I'm excited to see where all of this will lead. Wait, if we're so scared of the Gaians finding us, then why don't we just have our ships explore their system at night, when it's dark outside? The real first Hirunas said, to which Atleon asked one of his attendants to fetch a copy of the Atnian Rules of Succession. You know, just in case. Hold the door like your life depends on it, 'cause it just might. Over at the bridge, the frightened captain and part of his crew were frantically trying to keep the Gaians at bay. They'd barricaded the door with every significantly large piece of machinery that wasn't nailed down, even though they knew it was just a matter of time before the Gaians would breach their defenses and do God knows what to them. It didn't matter what the security feed had shown them. These Gaians sounded much scarier and more feral in person. They roared and screamed loudly, and with each push, the Inowayans could feel the door, as well as the items in front of it, shake violently. Their arms were slowly faltering. They wouldn't be able to keep this up for much longer. Gods, what was I thinking? I'm so gonna die. These things are gonna tear me appa. Galeth's train of thought stopped dead in its tracks. His stomach dropped. He couldn't breathe, and it suddenly felt as if liquid nitrogen was coursing through his veins. He heard something move above them. He was sure of it. Something was trying to get in via an alternative route, and it was fast. That was it. Galeth wanted to leave, to go back to his home, back to his mom. Considering their current predicament, a sentiment no doubt shared by the captain and the rest of the crew. After all, word around the ship was Galeth's mom was a fine lady and an even finer interior decorator. Son, if you don't start pushing again, I'm gonna have to start pushing my foe. And then the captain froze as well. They'd all heard it now, a loud growl followed by almost equally loud hollow thumping noises that were moving towards them. As if on cue, they all looked at the security monitor, which showed that only 2 Gaians were still pushing against the door while the third was missing. Not for long, though, as upon following the continued rumbling sound emanating from above them, their eyes eventually came to a halt when said sounds brought attention to a rather large air vent overlooking the entire room. At which point anyone with a keen interest in spaceship air circulation protocols must have realized that a light shimmer emanating from a predator's steely gaze and a mouth full of sharp white teeth were never part of that particular vent's initial design. Contractors can be really difficult about that sort of thing after all. They're in the walls. Fucking run! Oh. Clark was pretty sure he was dreaming at this point. Only a couple of hours ago, he'd just been performing his duties as a humble cleanliness engineer, scrubbing the floors, cleaning the toilets, the whole shebang, and now he'd just had a pillow fight with an off-color Ewok, only to then beat up two more for bullying the first one he'd met. Admittedly, it hadn't been the first time he'd drop-kicked a Care Bear, but at least this time he'd had a good enough excuse. After intercepting the distress signal, they were only supposed to check if anyone on board needed help, as well as figure out which government they'd have to inform, and perhaps taunt a diplomatically acceptable amount. But now Clark feared he may have complicated things a little bit by potentially mucking up a first contact scenario. One might argue that beating up 2 out of 3 aliens might have set a bad precedent. Then again, perhaps it wouldn't be too bad of an idea for humanity to not set the bar too high for themselves. At least the one he saved seemed amicable enough, if perhaps a little strange. Truthfully, Clark was secretly hoping everyone else was faring about as well as he was in regards to interacting with these creatures. That way, he wouldn't have to feel too bad about choosing violence so recklessly. Hell, he might actually get his wish fulfilled. Stella had just contacted him regarding a certain kerfuffle going down at where they'd assumed the bridge was. He would have loved to stay with his new alien friend, but unfortunately, Stella could get unpleasant when people tried to tactically evade her too often. And so with a deep sigh and after rubbing the sleep out of his eyes, he got up, waved his new friend goodbye, and headed out to go do his job, cleaning up other people's messes. It didn't take long for him to reach his colleagues, only to be met by the sight of 2 of them trying to kick down one of those futuristic-looking, sideways sliding doors. While from the other side, he heard what sounded like muffled bear-like grunts and squeaks. "Okay, I'm here. What's going on? Wait, where's Marshall?" Clark asked too, which he practically immediately got his answer as a loud thud could be heard coming from the surprisingly spacious vent above him, followed by a heavily accented, "Ouch, fucking shite." "Quick, lend us a hand here, will you?" Stella loudly demanded. "It appears these, whatever they are trapped and are becoming increasingly anxious. We need to rescue them as soon as possible before something bad happens. Poor whittle fluffles, they sound like they might die from fear any second now. Don't worry, darlings, Mama's coming," she roared before kicking the door as hard as she could. "As you've no doubt noticed, we've already sent our resident doctor and disappointed father figure into the vents to try and unlock it from the other side," Stella informed him with a surprisingly calm tone of voice and composed demeanor, which after her previous outburst made Clark's head spin. Should I be worried?" he asked while standing behind some debris and keeping reasonable distance between himself and his friends, who management had dubbed the uninsurables. "Nah, not really. They seem very sturdy and probably haven't seen that much wear and tear yet anyways." "I meant Marshall," Clark annoyedly added. "That's our Stella, all right. More concerned about the ship she's on than her own colleagues. Then again, usually the only thing standing between a human and the dark, cold vacuum of space is often a ship, so perhaps such a mindset wasn't entirely unreasonable," Clark thought to himself. Suddenly, various loud bangs could be heard from the direction of the vent, at which point the fuzzy little bear creatures seemed to quiet down and relax a bit. Guys, they're all staring at me. What do I do?" Marshall yelled through gritted teeth from behind the bridge's vent. He refused to look away in case the little bastards decided to bum rush him. Not even a few seconds later, one of the aliens seemed to yell something. It seemed scared, an emotion that had undoubtedly claimed hold of all of the room's occupants, and whose control was now growing ever so rapidly. Like a room full of contractors whose pay had been withheld for a month too long, they all collectively began to tear down the large pile of shiny space machinery. They made quick work of the makeshift barricade, after which they streamed out of the room like a flood of fluff and fright. Probably one of the more preferable floods one might find out in the cold, vast nothingness of space. Various emotions washed over the humans: nervousness, cute aggression, confusion, and of course the ever-so-common urge to administer a very enthusiastic and memorable colonoscopy to whomever had decided to design the vents in such a way that they'd be just big enough for a human to fit into. The Enowayans frantically ran past them, and if it hadn't been for Jeremiah and Clark restraining her, Stella would have probably managed to grab one of the little buggers, after which she'd have undoubtedly mothered it to death. All the various dolls she'd vivisected, melted, and/or splatted as a kid could attest to that. Then again, if those Pixar movies were anything to go by, they most definitely couldn't. She huffed and softly cursed under her breath as the teddy bear-like aliens ran past them before disappearing into the distance. Stella's not a bad person or anything. She's just been blessed with the general tact and grace of a silverback gorilla holding a hand grenade. She tends to be a little too excitable and has a strange affinity for breaking the things she touches, qualities not entirely sought after in an engineer, but at least she balances out her destructive nature with sheer talent and stubborn-headedness. Not even 2 seconds after the fuzzy teddy bear-like creature's cries and shouts had fizzled out in the distance, or yet another hairy and unintelligible creature had sought fit to voice his displeasure regarding his current predicament. This strange, inhuman creature was of course one of the crew's resident doctors, Marshall, a man commonly known for being as pleasant and patient as a kitchen timer taped to a hydraulic press. He claims to have found a loophole in the Hippocratic Oath, and we all suspect that his medical license may be more theoretical than the tangible variety most physicians claim ownership of. Once one of the cooks asked him if he was actually qualified to treat people, to which he let out an amused snort before hurriedly walking away from the conversation, mumbling something to himself involving the word people. Here you go, sir. Jeremiah, the last of my friends, said to Marshall before helping him get back into his spacesuit. Jeremiah is a polite young man, or well, more accurately, he's an intern, and so sucking up is practically part of his not an actual job description. On one hand, he's a hard and kind worker. He always runs errands and gets us drinks whenever people tell him to. But on the other, he's got this annoying habit of never being around when you need him. So, should we maybe retreat to our vessel and document our findings? I'm pretty sure the captain would want us to report that we've found alien life as soon as possible. What's more, I'm pretty certain we've already broken countless protocols, so I reckon it would behoove us to keep our heads down and await further orders, Jeremiah suggested politely. Yeah, sure, why not? After all, I'm pretty sure Stella can only carry back so many alien doohickeys. Ain't that right, you grubby thief? Marshall yelled accusatorily while looking at Stella, who was now frantically rummaging through a pile of alien machinery that not even a minute ago had been a makeshift barricade. Our suits didn't exactly have much in the way of pocket space, a problem Stella easily circumnavigated by simply opening up her suit and dumping the various alien devices directly into it. Apparently, she's been looting the ship ever since we'd boarded, and now, after practically shoving an entire barricade worth of shiny new tech into her suit, her kleptomania had become painfully apparent. At this point, her suit was bursting at the seams, making her look like a bulbous, humanoid mass of excitement and gleeful mischief. After having just escaped a brush with death, the startled Inawayans managed to regroup in what was essentially a large supply closet, this time making sure to cover the vents and any other opening, however small, with stray pieces of cloth, figuring that Gaian's vision was probably based on movement. Once their super-secret blanket fort had been secured, they began to chat among themselves. Good thing we've got the captain with us. If we hadn't followed his advice, most, if not all of us, would have been dead by now. Yeah, they couldn't even touch us, and not for a like of trying, mind you. Did you see how big they were? Even Maltic barely reached the short one's chin. Yeah, the one with the head, tail, and chest bumps looked ravenous. I was sure it was going to eat me. And what about the one in the vents? I was sure it was going to jump out and spit acid at us or something. Paf, that's nothing, Galeth remarked. That heavy-chested one actually managed to cut me with one of her talons, he said while rolling up his sleeve to show off the minuscule cut he'd gotten from Stella's fingernail, gently brushing against his upper arm. I think I saw a documentary about Gaia once, and I'm pretty sure that surviving an attack like that practically makes me an honorary part of their pack, he said arrogantly, while the other Enowayans rolled their eyes and looked at him as if he'd just farted through his mouth. If you mean the one they show every year during the Harvest Festival, all of that's just fear-mongering and imaginative guesses. For example, everyone knows that fluorigators aren't real, not even on Gaia, and don't even get me started on that whole sea of sodium chloride bullshit. All pure believer ought to only watch proper church-approved media. Won't rot your brain as much. Yeah, right, retorted Galeth. Their theories are just as baseless and outlandish, like how Gaians can apparently fire up to half a liter of gastric acid from their mouth when threatened. And well, did you see anyone melt a minute ago? Well, no, but, Galeth, are you okay? You look pale and you've been panting for a while now. Galeth, argumentative rival, asked concernedly. Oh, yeah, don't worry. I just think I gotta lay down for a little bit. Don't worry. It'll take more than a Gaian attack to keep me down. Galeth tried to ease his contemporary's fears before loudly coughing. He tried to gently lower himself onto the ground, but found that most of his strength had already left him, and so with a hollow thud, fell to the ground helplessly. While staring upwards, Galeth could see all his fellow Enoweans crowd around him. Their expressions had become deformed with concern and fear. It must have been those Gaians. They sucked out his soul. No, it's that scratch. They must have poisoned him. His insides are probably turning to soup as we speak. Don't be dim, the captain yelled at the murmuring crowd while pushing past a couple engineers to get to Galeth. He grabbed his arm and knowingly nodded. Yup, it's just as I'd feared. Do you know what this is, Captain? Aye, lad, only seen it a couple times before, though I'd recognize it anywhere. My mother-in-law was a priestess who specialized in exorcisms, after all. You see young Galeth here. The captain paused for dramatic effect. Has been cursed by the Gaian's vile soul magic. The crowd gasped. So, is he gonna die? Aye, or worse. You see, if Galeth manages to cling on to life for more than 12 hours after the initial scratch, he will start to feel his body twitch and shake as it grows increasingly hotter. His limbs will grow rapidly to disproportionate sizes. It will feel as if bugs are wriggling beneath his skin. He will sprout fangs, horns, and claws. And then, once again the foolish captain paused for dramatic effect, he will turn into one of them. The crowd gasped. He'll eat us. He'll turn us into Gaians too. Maybe we should, Galeth could barely hear anything as his body continued to be at the mercy of this strange Gaian influence. It was like torture. Pain dulled his senses. He felt oh so tired, but he knew that if he fell asleep now, he might not wake up again. Don't worry, everyone, the captain bellowed. We need not resort to such extreme methods just yet. There is one way to rid young Galeth of this curse. We need to kill the creature that did this to him. Yeah. Just as the Enoweans had regrouped, so were the humans sauntering back to their own ship. They'd almost reached the halfway point when they suddenly heard a loud bear-like screech. Hey, did you guys hear that too? Marshall asked. It had come from around the corner and was accompanied by the pitter-patter of what sounded like roughly 24 anxious Muppets. The four of them slowed down and looked back only to see a crowd of determinate Teddy Ruxpins rushing towards them. They were covered in some sort of dark blue liquid while wildly flailing flashlights. Or at least they assumed those things were flashlight right up until one of them aimed it at Jeremiah's posterior and burned a hole right through his suit. Ouch, oh heavens! He yammered as the photon riffle left him with a rather nasty-looking second-degree burn, at which point the humans turned around and began to run as hard as they could. Don't worry, kid, Marshall said. I can easily fix that once we get back to the shh. The doctor ducked right as a beam was about to hit the back of his head. So with that in mind, be sure to shield my body with your own. With the Enoweans hot on their trail, the humans continued to run through the bowels of the ship. Due to the lights being off and the fact that bolts of colored light kept flashing past their heads, the situation almost reminded them of a rave. Or at least it did right up until someone got hit and the smell conjured up the mental images of a barbecue. Clark was pretty sure he saw Stella lick her lips last time Jeremiah got hit, and hoped to God she was just Scratch that. Both scenarios had him pray internally for Jer's immortal soul. Luckily for the humans, it appears that while desperation and fear are great motivators, those can only get you so far when your adversary has a body much more proficient in regards to endurance running. And that's already discounting the fact that humans on average have somewhat longer legs. Oh gods, how are they still going? One of the exhausted Enoweans tried to say while coughing and wheezing heavily. It's like they're, Magical? Another one added. Of course, Captain Akilos remarked. They're near their cradle world. Their goddess is obviously empowering them with her vile soul magic. But don't worry, we'll catch up with them eventually. All we have to do is bless these hallways, he said while smearing some of the blood staining his fur onto the walls. And sooner or later, there will be nowhere left for them to run. I can't believe I'm actually about to do this, Reka murmured to herself. The flood of her own kinsmen had swept her up, and she'd been carried to the aforementioned supply closet blanket fort, aka the Cuddle Hut. Luckily for her, she'd managed to pretend she had been with them all along so as to not attract any suspicion. Afterwards, when they decided to go out and attempt suicide by Gaian, she'd volunteered to stay back and take care of what was your name again? Pained grunts and groans emanated from the weakened, frail heap of Enowayan that was laying in front of her. I think I'll just refer to you as my patient then, if that's all right with you. Reka hadn't been the only one to volunteer, but luckily as soon as she'd reminded them about him, possibly turning into a Gaian, or that perhaps he was contagious, everyone else suddenly seemed pretty okay with letting her handle this one all by herself. Now then, I hope you're in the mood for a small adventure, 'cause my conscience won't allow me to just let you die here like this. I doubt killing one of them, if that's even possible, will do much good. So with that in mind, I've thought of an equally desperate, yet slightly less suicidal plan. Believe it or not, but I'm actually on somewhat good terms with one of the Gaians, and from what I can tell, I don't think they're all that bad. So what if I just brought you to them? Maybe they'll know how to fix this. Of course, if all else fails and you begin to transform, you'll at least be with your own kind. Or get a quick death. That last part she whispered softly under her breath. Wouldn't that be better than just wasting away and dying a slow and agonizing death? Galeth let out another pained groan. Great, it's settled then, she said before letting out a loud, strenuous huff and lifting him on the stretcher she'd grabbed while everyone else was gathering blood bags. Just hold on tight and everything will be all right before you know it, I promise. She pushed the floating slab of metal onto the hallway in what she assumed was the right direction. Gods, I hope I'm right about this, she thought to herself. Within the Church, yes, of the Great Alliance, there's a wide variety of conflicting theories in regards to the afterlife. For example, some believe in reincarnation, others think there's some kind of heavenly golden meadow, and a small minority believes that death is something that only happens to other people, right up until fate decides otherwise, of course. Keeping all of this in mind, Reka was pretty sure that what she was doing now might get her disbarred from any and all post-mortal events, occasions, and celebrations. Not that she ever particularly cared what the gods might think of her, of course, although that being said, perhaps it would be more accurate to say that she'd never considered herself noteworthy of their attention, and therefore scrutiny, in the first place. That is, of course, disqualifying this precise moment wherein she was sure that they were all watching her, wearing matching jerseys and loudly screaming at her like an enraged sports fan might when one of their home team's athlete is about to score a point for the opposing team. She could almost imagine some of them waving flags, holding up banners, and blowing air horns while yelling profanities at her. At the very least, it'd match how she was feeling right about now. She felt guilty, traitorous, and most of all, evil. No, she shook her head and tried to collect her thoughts. I won't let my fears control me and override my sense of reason. Gods be damned. I was blessed with sapience, so now watch me use it. With her spirit revitalized and renewed conviction, the young Enowayan bravely ran down the hall in search for help, in search for the Gaians. Clark and his fellow humans were walking through the darkened halls of the ship in search for the exit. Well, technically in a spaceship, anything can be an exit as long as you've got a sufficiently powerful weapon and a head as empty as space itself. Therefore, it'd be more accurate to state that they were looking for their very specific circumstantial visitation and emergency assistance hole. The legal suits had vigorously insisted that they carefully refer to such diplomatically sensitive scenarios using jargon pulled from a very limited and predefined list of words, or that they at the very least mind their volume when nearby anyone donning a tie as opposed to the company-mandated scowl, especially if they suspect said person has a law degree and an aversion to garlic. If it hadn't been for the army of moldy monchiches, they'd been back already. Navigating through a darkened ship is already hard enough without getting shot at by alien bear creatures, drenched in their own blood. Granted, non-lethally, of course, but no one felt particularly inspired to stop and investigate whether said assumption was 100% correct. And thus, in their haste, our humans managed to take a couple wrong rights when they left the Enowayans in the dust. Are they still behind us? Stella asked in between loud gasps, too tired to even look behind her. We lost them about 5 minutes ago, I think, Clark responded. Wait, what do you mean 5 minutes ago? Then why the fuck are we still running? I feel like I'm about to drop dead any second. Well, began Marshall, no one wants to get left behind. That and adrenaline is one hell of a drug. I should know. I always bring extra. Oh, and Jeremiah's still running because he's an intern and no one has ordered him not to yet. Not true. I just figured that ooh, shit! Jeremiah yelled while weaving to the side. He just barely managed to avoid colliding with two Enowayans coming from an adjacent hallway. Followed by Marshall dryly remarking, "All right, you can stop now." The humans who'd already begun to trail behind the muscled ex-farmhand all slowed down before stopping in front of the Enowayans. One of the two aliens stared at the humans like a deer caught in headlights, while the other looked a lot less fresh. Wait a minute, Clark thought to himself as he appeared to recognize the Enowayan pushing the futuristic-looking stretcher. It didn't take long for his suspicion to be confirmed, as the Enowayan's expression seemed to turn from sudden fright to nervous relief. She frantically began to point at the four of them, and then at the poor sickly-looking alien, more specifically at a tiny cut on his arm. I think it wants us to help its friend, Clark pondered aloud. Maybe we should... Stella gasped. Oh, no, my whittle baby has an ouchie. And now my brain has an aneurysm, Marshall huffed sarcastically. Hold on. Clark perked up and turned to Stella, who was fidgeting guiltily. Did you do this? Did you touch something again? You know what happens when you do that. I'm not sure. I guess I may have felt one of them accidentally brush against my finger when you and Jeremiah were trying to stop me from adopting one, she muttered dejectedly. Gosh darn it. If only we'd been faster. We should have expected her to try and grab one, Jeremiah added. This is the petting zoo incident all over again. Only difference is that Clark hasn't drop-kicked anyone yet. Whatever, let's just drop it, Clark remarked. Whatever ancient curse is affecting Stella can wait. Now we gotta... Marshall stared at him with an expression of mock annoyance before interrupting. As usual, force our oh-so-benevolent and respectable doctor to take care of this poor creature. Why, of course. After all, it's my duty as a vet, errand of medical school to save as many lives as I can. Marshall laughed nervously while the others were sarcastically staring at him, as if to say, yeah, sure, buddy. On top of that, Marshall was pretty sure he saw Jeremiah sneakily slip Clark $20. Now then, I'd hate to be the bearer of bad news, but aren't we forgetting something? Stella remarked. Because doctor or not, I doubt there's a whole lot we'll be able to do unless we find our way back to our ship quickly. I take it we can't rely on Stella's womanly intuition or Jeremiah's powerful sense of smell either, can we? Marshall asked. Wait, guys, look, I think our new friend here might know the way, Clark yelled excitedly while pointing at the Enowayan, who was now briskly jogging down the hallway, before quickly stopping and beckoning them to hurry up already. Let's just hope we don't come to regret this, Marshall muttered. Gods, what happened? And why do I feel so tired? Galeth murmured to himself after finally regaining consciousness. He tried to recall the hours leading up to his brief dance with death, but alas, the only memories the weakened Enowayan managed to conjure up were a blurry string of vague shapes and indistinguishable sounds. He remembered being led somewhere after trying to lay down for a bit. Then someone had hooked him up to some sort of strange machine that had done something to him. He could vaguely recall hearing the term germ-bleached before ending up in this strange white room. Where am I? Am I dead? He tried to get up, but quickly found that he'd barely had enough strength to lift his head, never mind the rest of his body. Just as he was about to struggle and scream for help, he heard a dull click. Someone had entered the room. She was Enowean, just like him. She seemed familiar. Had he met her before? No, wait, she was part of the crew. Yes, I was part of an expedition. And then, Gaians! Suddenly realization struck him as Galeth's still somewhat fatigued and painkiller-addled mind began to put the pieces together. I was gravely wounded, and then someone brought me to He felt his heart pound rapidly. His gaze instinctively darted from one corner of the room to the other, all while starting to hyperventilate. Despair washed over him. He felt trapped, as if his fate was sealed, and any moment now someone would come and end his feeble existence. Fantasizing about Lovecraftian Dommy-mommies on the holonet was one thing, but then to actually get captured and potentially eaten by one. Oh gods, I'm such an idiot, he chastised himself. No, this isn't right. This isn't fair. I have to get out of here. I have to escape. Using every ounce of energy he still had, Galeth tried to get up once again, only to be stopped by who he assumed was the one who'd brought him into this mess in the first place. Don't move, you're still too weak, she informed him kindly. Look, I know how you feel, but trust me, everything will be fine. You're safe here. No one is going to harm you. But what about... Look, I know they seem scary and all, but you're not dead, are you? Well, no, but... Good. Keep that in mind, because it was the Gaians that made sure you'd stay that way. You quite literally owe them your life, and well, to a lesser extent me too, I guess, since I helped bring you here, she remarked with an arrogant smirk. Well, yeah, I suppose I do feel Suddenly Galeth froze as his eyes darted to the humanoid face that was now peering in through a crack in the door. It curiously ogled the two of them through bespectacled eyes. Ah yes, I've taken the liberty of calling that one touchy, since she can't help but touch us constantly and talks to us in a much more high-pitched voice than when they're talking to the other Gaians, she said as Stella, upon noticing that she'd been spotted, flung the door open and quickly walked over to the two Enoweans. I know. It takes some getting used to, but they're not as dangerous as they might appear, Reka advised him. Having said that, though, I'd advise against looking at them directly for extended periods of time. Otherwise, you might get a headache or become nauseous. Oh, and don't stare directly into their eyes. Once you do, it gets tricky to look away. At that moment, the ponytailed Gaian began to gently pet and scratch Reka's back. Oh yeah, that's the spot, she softly muttered to herself. Don't get me wrong, technically they're still eldritch abominations, stains upon reality that defy the laws of nature and deserve our contempt, she said while closing her eyes in euphoria as Stella continued to diligently pet her. But frankly, I think they're pretty neat, and we should probably just leave them be. Besides, if the gods really want them gone that badly, they can just send us some signs or do it themselves. But they're supposed to be evil. What if they're trying to trick us? Galeth remarked. Well then, I gotta get one to trick me all the way to retirement on a bi-daily basis. Look, I feel like you Galeth's no doubt impressively worded rebuttal was cut short as Stella, who now had stopped coddling Raka, took a step closer to the male Enowean and began to mercilessly hug him. Galeth felt conflicted. On one hand, he was afraid that the Gaian might suddenly eat or crush him, perhaps even both at the same time, but on the other, this Gaian was firmly holding him against her bosom while caressing his back, something he'd perversely fantasized about not too long ago. God damn it, Stella, again! A second Gaian had just walked into the room and was yelling at Touchy in his native tongue, who, with a nervous fear in her eyes, responded by quickly letting go of Galeth and taking a step back. The one standing in the doorway was holding some sort of archaic lock that had been broken and was staring accusatorily at its kinsman. To the two Enoweans, it seemed as if Touchy was trying to verbally defend her actions, or was at least trying to come up with a believable enough excuse. Alas, her pleas fell on deaf ears. The one in the doorway wasn't having any of it and beckoned for her to leave the room, to which Touchy responded by grabbing the bed frame and using her best puppy dog eyes. Having had enough of her antics, the stern-looking Gaian sighed before grabbing something from his bag. In one hand, he was holding a fluffy doll representing some sort of cute quadruped creature, and in the other, a blowtorch. To Touchy's horror, the other Gaian began to threateningly wiggle the device's nozzle in front of the stuffed animal's face. She let out an ear-piercing shriek before rushing over to save the poor inanimate object. Having successfully diverted Touchy's attention towards something she can't accidentally break with love and affection, the Gaian man threw the doll as hard as he could down the hallway. As soon as Touchy, who now looked slightly more feral, crossed the threshold, the lab coat-wearing Gaian hastily closed the door behind himself. A wise decision, especially since Reika is the reason that HR personnel avoid walking too closely to the airlocks. He walked over to Galeth and began to gently examine him, while also ignoring the frantic banging on the door. Galeth theorized that the Gaians must have studied Reika's physiology, and that the one in front of him was now estimating his overall health based on what they'd figured out about hers. A much more rational and intelligent course of action than the Enowayans would have expected. Then again, that appeared to be the case for most facts they'd been told about these cosmic horrors. What did strike Galeth as odd was that the Gaian seemed to have quite a few burns. One above his right eye, 2 on his hands, and 1 on his neck. Reika must have seen him staring, cause after letting out a soft cough to divert his attention. She began to explain certain unfortunate developments that had happened in his absence. Having lost a couple screws, the captain and whichever crew members were still willing to follow him had begun what was essentially a suicidal witch hunt. They'd hunted down and fired on any and all Gaians still roaming their ship. Based on the fact that none of the Gaians who Reika had seen were covered in blood, only burns, she'd figured that most, if not all of them, had refused to fight back and instead opted to return to their vessel peacefully as well as hastily. Although she did remember one of them returning with what appeared to be an injured foot. As she told him this, Galeth winced. He really hoped that said Gaian had simply stubbed their toe. "So then what happens now?" Galeth asked, to which Reika threw up her hands and shrugged. "Honestly, I wasn't sure you'd wake up, and for as far as I could tell, neither did the Gaians. But now that you mention it, I'd say we go out there and show the others you're still alive." "You think that's a good idea? What if the Gaians are evil after all? Or what if the captain and his men think we're mindless thralls and shoot us on sight?" Galeth asked nervously. "Well, I suppose that'd be dreadfully inconvenient. But let's face it, we can't stay here forever, and I fear that brokering peace between the Gaians and our own kind might be the only choice we've got. Also, I'm sure as shit not leaving without one of these big boys. Maybe I can get one to stay with me. Ooh, and maybe I can teach them some tricks," Reika said before beckoning for the doctor to come and pet her, just like Touchy had done. The Gaian blew air out of its mouth, which Galeth took as annoyed resignation, before moving a little closer and caressing Reika's back lazily. "You know you sound completely crazy right now, right?" Galeth remarked. "Well, yeah, but to be fair, according to the Holy Scriptures, you'd have to be to bargain with Gaia's children. That being said, I'd sell my soul if it means getting pampered like this every day." Back in the supply closet turned war room, the captain kept busy writing down his findings, while remotely delegating what remained of his troops. Most of those yellow-belly cowards had deserted after their initial counterattack had failed. He'd even overheard some murmured gossip criticizing his infallible holy blood theory. Well, what did they know? He and the brave few who'd seen reason had already managed to push the Gaians back to their ship, including an already transformed Galeth. Poor kid, he'd forever remember him, his bravest soldier. He'd rather go into exile than risk putting his kinsmen in danger, not like those cowards who'd fled with their tails behind their legs, just because the Gaians shrugged off a couple photon bolts. Soon those sniffling cretins would come crawling back, asking for protection. He was sure of that. "Now then, here goes nothing," the captain murmured to himself while pressing send on his newly made report. It contained everything he'd learned about the Gaians, and once it reached civilized space, everyone would know the Enowayans were the chosen race, the supreme beings, vanquishers of the horrors lurking in the deepest depths of the abyss. It in detail described how Enowayan blood was considerably more holy than that of the other races, and that this was hinted at in one of their species' holy texts, written thousands of years ago and translated only a couple dozen times. It mentioned how photon bolts, while non-lethal, frightened them, or how getting scratched or bitten by one would turn you into one such monster. And of course it mentioned how he and his crew bravely fought of these apostles of death and destruction. After a relatively short and uneventful journey, the Galactic Alliance's rescue and recovery fleet had finally arrived in the Hela system, led by the eldest of the two Adnian sibling monarchs. Traditionally speaking, every other fleet that had ventured into Gaian space had always been commanded by one of the quadrant's heads of state. So seeing as Seni and Sano's parents had in essence told them to share the throne till one of them either proves themselves worthier and or gets assassinated, they were both qualified for the job. So to her brother's horror and the other council members' astonishment, Seni eagerly volunteered. Sano tried to protest. This was his older sister after all. But alas, his arguments were drowned out by the other council members, who were singing her praises and showering her with suspiciously loud gestures of encouragement. But wait, sis, what are you doing? This is maddeningly brave of you, young lady. You truly are a credit to your race and an example to us all, one of the Quizinian senators remarked loudly. No, this is stupid. She's going to do... I think that she will make a fine ruler someday. Such a courageous and bright young woman, a member of Edion's retinue remarked. And thus Seni had found herself at the edges of the dark goddess's domain, facing a rather unexpected sight. A strange ship, no doubt Gaian, had attached itself to the subtlety and was just sitting there, menacingly. Both she as well as the rest of the council had expected to only find the remains of the ship, if perhaps in multiple pieces with the Gaians long gone or waiting in ambush. But for whatever reason, they decided to stick around in plain view. They hadn't even attacked them yet. Sure, they'd bombarded their fleet with all manner of strange, undecipherable signals, but other than that, there was no reason to believe that these creatures were hostile. Therefore, in opposition to her advisor, as well as the captains under her command, who'd all rather fire and flee, she'd ordered the entire fleet to stay back and wait. That is, everyone aside from a small contingent of elite soldiers who now wished they were all elite bakers instead. Their mission was simple. Get in, rescue any survivors, find out what the heck is going on, and get out. Once the shuttle had landed in one of the emergency hangars, the first thing the soldiers noticed was a general overabundance of blood and an underabundance of courage. Half of them were leaning against a wall barfing, while the others felt how their knees were faltering, and they had to sit down for a second. The Alliance's military doctrine, much like those of the governments that preceded it, strictly forbade any and all weapons that might cause direct blood loss, on account of them being unnecessarily vicious and cruel. Which in part is why, for these otherwise proud warriors, the scene in front of them was simply too much. It was rather puzzling. There were only supposed to be around 70 people on the ship, and yet the first hallway they'd encountered was already covered in enough blood to summon a small pantheon of dark gods. They'd continued to venture through the ship's bloody hallways in search for any sort of clue as to what might have happened. Who knows, perhaps a couple crew members are actually still alive. Granted, they'd found an amazing hiding spot. After all, we technically haven't found any bodies yet. It hadn't taken long after these thoughts had crossed the sergeant's mind when all of a sudden something fuzzy frantically ran into him. Speak of the Gaian, he thought to himself as the Enowayan quickly got back up. He noticed only a second too late that it had a mad look in its eyes, at which point the Enowayan jumped backwards and aimed its photon rifle at the soldiers. Who are you? Are you Adnians or are you Gaians in disguise? Listen, friend, The sergeant tried to calm him down. Take off your armor, now, strip! What? I think the Gaians already got to him, one of the soldiers in the back remarked. I said take off your armor, all of you. I have to make sure you aren't going to turn into Gaians. Easy, friend, we're here to rescue you. Look, I'm not sure what you're talking about, but if you come with us to the ship, we could... Hey, wait a minute. Before the soldier could finish his sentence, the Enowayan, who decided he'd heard enough and wouldn't fall for these Gaian tricks, ran away as quickly as its fuzzy legs would allow. Don't spit on me! Your Gaian soul magic won't work on a holy warrior of the gods! I have holy blood! It yelled before disappearing in the distance. Well, that was... odd, one of the soldiers commented. Do you think the same could happen to us? Don't be daft. their sergeant started, "we're some of the Alliance's most elite warriors. Obviously, the gods are watching over us, just as they always have. Now move it, because I doubt they'd protect us from death by old age." The more they explored the ship, the more it reminded them of a war zone. Doors had been barged in or ripped of their hinges. Furniture was either missing or destroyed, and blood-stained debris cluttered the hallways. Something awful had happened here, and yet there were no corpses to be found. Once in a while, they'd bump into yet another crazed Enowean, either paranoid and under the assumption that everyone else might secretly be a Gaian, or simply too terrified to think rationally, and would therefore run away as soon as they'd caught a glimpse of the soldiers. The men dejectedly continued onward. So far, this mission had been anything but fruitful, and they feared that at the end of the day, they'd be forced to leave empty-handed. Or at least that was the general consensus, right up until they stumbled onto what was gonna be one of the strangest arguments of their lives. "Hey, do you hear that?" "Yeah, it sounds like we finally found some people who haven't been turned mad by those Gaians," one of the soldiers remarked as they all made their way towards the source of the commotion. None of them knew what to expect once they'd opened the door to the cafeteria. Perhaps the last sane remnants of the Enowean crew trying to survive. Perhaps the Gaians were mimicking the sounds of those they'd slaughtered and were luring them into a trap. Or maybe, just maybe, they'd already succumbed to Gaia's eldritch influences and would soon find themselves at the mercy of her abominable children. They froze the second they'd flung open the door. "Shut up and listen to me for a second. He is not the Messiah," a female Enowean yelled while standing on a table. On one side of the room stood what they assumed was the ship's captain, together with a sizable portion of his crew, while on the other a bunch of armored Gaians next to a wheelchair-bound Enowean. How else did he survive after being mauled and infected by a Gaian? Even if he's not the son of one of the creator gods, of which there were coincidentally about as many as there were races in the Alliance, he's at least a distant relative, the captain retorted while pointing at a wheelchair-bound Galeth. "For the last time, it was the Gaians that healed him. They're not here to kill or even hurt us. In fact, quite the opposite," Rika yelled. "Wait, they're here to make love to us?" the captain asked nervously while pointing at himself. "What? No, that's a..." Rika sighed while trying to compose herself. "They're just here to help us. Up till now, the only people they've hurt were a couple of cultists who, in my humble opinion, deserved it, which has led me to believe that many of the church's teachings on them are..." She made sure to choose her next words carefully, lest they earn her a stern talking to from the church. Incomplete and not entirely accurate when interacting with them on an individual level," she muttered. "Heresy!" the captain bellowed. The insult didn't seem to bother Rika, as she, without looking, grabbed the arm of one of the Gaians and placed it on her back, after which the alleged cosmic herald of death and destruction began to eagerly bless the bear-like alien with the scritches, the highest honor a Gaian can bestow upon an Enowean, or at least that's what she assumed. This was just too bizarre. Whereas the Enoweans the soldiers had encountered up till now seemed paranoid and deadly afraid, the one standing on the table in front of them was anything but. In fact, she seemed to be having the time of her life as one of the Gaians repeatedly ran his fingers through her back fur. Another Enowean, who had apparently cheated death, sat somewhat nervously next to those monsters while nodding along to whatever the other one was saying. Don't worry, we are here to rescue you," one of the soldiers said in such a way that it sounded more like a question. The room fell quiet as everyone only now noticed the group of heavily armed Atnians standing in the doorway. "Oh my God, she tamed them," another soldier shouted. "My God, of course. So that's what you were trying to tell me, Reyna," the captain said, his voice tinged with pride and admiration. "What no? You know what? Sure, why not? I used my holy blood in an ancient ritual together with my irresistible feminine wiles to tame the hearts of these otherwise violent and dangerous creatures," she said with deflated disposition and a desire to bash her head against something hard and breakable. Back on the royal cruiser, Seni was witnessing everything through hidden recording devices embedded in the soldier's armor, all while munching on some sort of crunchy, bagged vegetable-like snack. Her eyes were practically glued to the screen in fascination. If that woman has actually managed to tame multiple Gaians, then I'll have to convince her to teach me how to do it, ASAP. She thought to herself before gasping. She can come to one of the club cult meetings and give a seminar. Seni began to feel all excited and giddy at the idea of having her own Gaian to protect her, to eat from her hand, and of course to show off to the other heads of state. She let out an evil grin as she thought of how frightened they'd all be in its presence. Well, except maybe Edion, he'd probably just laugh at the others' discomfort and take some pictures for his self-help blog. Of course, the only self he was helping with it was himself. But if I want to adopt a Gaian, I can't just go and get one from Gaia. I'll need somewhere to study and interact with them in a safe environment, somewhere where they can get used to being among members of the Alliance. Seni scratched her chin while pondering her options. She'd barely had a minute to think before the fleet's captains, who'd all viewed the footage as well and were no doubt anxious at seeing so much blood and madness, disturbed her with countless messages, wondering when the gods' appointed interpreter would give them their next order. She looked at the way the Gaian ship had connected itself to the subtlety, and then at the various notifications which displayed which ship it had come from, as well as the vessel's primary use. GA, prosperous food and menial labor. GA, spirit, religion, and medical aid. GA, Eureka research and development. Another mischievous grin appeared where her innocent childlike smile should have been. She spoke for the gods after all. No one would dare oppose her, and if she played her cards right, it would take ages for the authoritative to catch wind of what she was doing. Nye-he-he-he, she giggled. And so Seni set out to turn this rescue and recovery mission into one aimed more in accordance to her own interests. She wanted to watch, learn, and eventually even interact with these Gaians, and to this end she'd order for the fleet to be transformed into something that would more or less resemble a makeshift habitat. Reka and Galith, the first Inawayans who'd managed to interact with the Gaians, would be promoted to oversee this soon-to-be newly created community, as well as try to communicate her ideas and intentions with the Gaians. Luckily for Seni, the company these Gaians work for, the Rustwell Corporation, as well as the country Chos tax haven it's situated in, the Independent People's Republic of Texas, would most certainly not be opposed to such a cooperative venture. After all, ever since the split, which was totally mutual by the way, don't let those other lesser states tell you otherwise. High Governor Reganezrochiyeks, a man famous for always wearing a cowboy hat and a hastily drawn-on mustache, had been itching to make some new allies. Besides that, she'd also need to assign some scientists to figuring out why almost everyone who'd come into contact with the Gaians had slowly lost their mind. She sighed. Right now, I fear that the only people who are thinking straight are me, and that Ray... Wait a minute. Fear? She pondered out loud. Who knows? Might be onto something there. I'm so excited. This is all going to be so much fun, Seni mused to herself while writing the royal orders and decrees that would shape the fate of Galaxy, hopefully for the better. If anything, soon life in the Alliance would end up becoming a whole lot less boring.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.